Hi, everyone, and welcome to Soil Samples. My name is Margarita Osipian, and I'm part of the curatorial team for Sonic Acts. During tonight's event, we're going to get our hands into the dirt and engage with the topic of soil and its geopolitical, colonial, and bodily entanglements across performances and live talks. We're here in the streaming studio in Rotterdam with our wonderful live stream team, and our speakers and performers for tonight will be joining us from across various time zones. I'm also here with my little plant, which looks digital, but it's real, I promise. Soil Samples is the second event as part of Night Air, which is a series of online transmissions that aims to make pollution visible by bringing forth the various side effects of modernity, from colonial exploitation of people and resources to perpetual inequalities brought about by the destruction of the environment and common land. In other words, destructive capitalist practices that shape both our environment and human, non-human relations. So before coming into the live stream here, all of you landed on a page that gave you the option either to join us now in this virtual space, which we're all in, or to watch two films. So we're really happy to be screening these two films, which engage with soil in quite different but intersecting ways. So the first film that we're screening is Florence Lazar's You Think the Earth is a Dead Thing from 2019, which looks at the global ecological crisis from the perspective of the island of Martinique. It examines the ecological and political context through encounters with farmers, an ethnopharmacologist, and a local medical herbalist. The context is one of widespread pollution resulting from the intensive use of chlordazone. For over 20 years, the carcinogenic insecticide was used by a small group of descendants of the first colonial slaveholders to settle in the French West Indies in order to protect the banana plantations that dominate Martinique's export industry. The various protagonists of the film explore alternative approaches in the fight against environmental destruction using ancestral practices and knowledge. Thus, the portrayal of nature constantly shifts. Sometimes it appears domesticated and exploited on a massive scale, at other times contaminated by unseen toxic substances, or again as an ally in the struggle for survival. And the second film that we're screening is actually a film essay by Felipe Cesar called Mind Soil from 2014, which revisits the Ghanaian agronomist Amilcar Cabral's work studying the erosion of soil in the Portuguese Alentejo region. Through to his engagement as one of the leaders of the African liberation movement. This line of thought intertwines documentation on an experimental gold mining site operated today by a Canadian company and located in the same Portuguese area once studied by Cabral. The reading of the essay explores the space, surfaces, and textures of the images, proposing past and present definitions of soil as a repository of memory, trace, exploitation, crisis, arsenal, treasure, and palimpsest. So the films are playing now. They started this morning, and they're kind of streaming on these 2-hour cycles, and you can watch them until Sunday at midnight Central European Summer Time. So during the course of tonight's program, we invite and encourage you to engage with the discussions via the live chat here, which you probably see to the right of your screen. And Mirna is going to be moderating the chat. We'll be sharing different links and information there, and we'll also relay your questions to me, and then we can discuss them during the question and answer kind of conversational period of tonight's program, which will take place following all of the performances and talks. If your question is for a specific person, please specify that. It makes it a little bit easier in the process of answering. So I'm going to quickly switch to another view, so away from this beautiful wide view into my little camera view. So bear with me for 1 second, and then I'll introduce our first artist that will be starting off the evening. All right. Great, that went smooth. Our first, wait, give me 1 second. Yes. So as I mentioned, we're going to start tonight's program with an artist presentation and binaural audio performance by Felicity Mangan, who's an Australian sound artist and composer who has been based in Berlin since 2008. In different situations, from solo performances and installations to collaborative projects with other artists, Felicity plays with the timbre of animal voices and field recordings to create minimal, quasi-bioacoustic environments. Recently, she's been exploring the fundamentals of soil life and interspecies creativity, delving into soil soundscape equipped with sensors and imagination. Just a little note that in order to have the best experience while watching and especially listening to Felicity's presentation, we encourage you to put on headphones. It's not mandatory, but highly recommended. So I will pass everything over to Felicity now.
Thank you, Margareta and Sonic X, for having me. Yes, so I'll be doing a live performance, but beforehand, I'm going to talk a little bit about how this project came about. So in 2018, I was invited to do a micro residency on a pilot farm in southern Finland for 5 days by media artist Timo Lemmurusu for his Tropic Verses project, which is an artistic exploration into the life and phenomena in and around Earth's body of soil. I was to create a sound work in response to my stay on the farm, at this time with former colleague Christina Ertel-Shirley, who was known partly for her work with generating sounds from plant life. This residency experience made me aware of the existence of soil life and how soil is vital for improving the environment through the restoration of topsoil, also known as humus, and its biodiversity. This also, that is often depleted by pollutants and chemicals on agricultural land. I learned that when the soil is healthy, carbon is able to return from the atmosphere to the pediosphere to help improve our planet. So my sound work became a sonic exploration through the use of field recordings, influenced by this phenomenon of carbon cycles, soil structure, and humus that consists of decaying plants and animal matter, as well as a quarter of the world's living species. For this project, I wanted to demonstrate these ideas. Since soil wasn't going to narrate the information directly into my field recording tools, I began to explore the farm and find ways of illustrating these concepts that were found on the site. I will show you some photos of machines that I found and that allowed me to eavesdrop into, with the use of contact microphones, to be able to listen and record sounds of the machines droning and clicking away while monitoring the cycles and patterns of carbon and other gases present on the surface of the soil and in the atmosphere. To illustrate this idea further, I also recorded the sound of wind patterns that resonated in everyday objects that existed on the farm with the stereo microphone of my Zoom recorder. For example, I found flapping plastic tape fences, screeching windmills, and the sound of actual wind. So I'm continuing to develop this work. In summer, I will return to Finland again for 2 months to do a residency at the Titanic Gallery in Turku and make more field trips. So this current photo that you're looking at, so in 2018, it was a particularly dry year without almost any rain on the farm. In this photo, I was experimenting with recording the soil with the contact mic. I use the contact mic because it allows me to listen directly to the vibrations and resonance of objects and matter. While listening to the soil, I didn't hear any vibrations of soil life, so I tapped on the soil with my hand, producing some form of dry but hollow sound of the very dry soil. During the field work, I wasn't able to actually record any vibration from the soil, but this summer I'm hoping to get some better recordings with some new microphones that I've learned about. So basically, I ended up taking a lot of recordings from the general environment of the farm. So yeah, the next slide, it shows my recorder. And then the next photo this is me wandering around this testing site where I found these various mysterious machines monitoring gas cycles. In the next slide, You can see a close-up of one of these devices. Maybe someone can tell me more about this. There wasn't any scientists or much information here. We just saw these objects that were very intriguing. So in the next photo, you can see there's some blue tape, and underneath the blue tape is some little contact mics. So when I stuck these to the pole, I could hear a repetitive clicking sound, like almost like a click track or a metronome, as well as a high frequency. The next slide, this is a wide shot of another testing device. It looks like a container with arms measuring something from the atmosphere. In the next photo, this is a close-up. You can see it kind of looks a little bit like an installation or maybe a school science project with sort of like found objects. Again, I do not know what it's doing, but it seems to be making some kind of atmosphere recording. In the next photo, it's another one of these arms that is sticking out. And then the next photo. So here is this little house looking thing. So in the next photo, you will see there is more contact mics stuff. Here, this thing was quite amazing. When I stuck the contact mic, you couldn't really hear much when you stood next to it, but when you put the contact mics, I could hear this very bassy drone sound that you'll hear later in the piece. The next slide. So this is looking up at from below at a windmill. I took some more contact microphone recordings of this, and which allowed me to capture the resonance of the frame of the wind that was turning the sails, which made this really nice screeching sound. Then, so when we were on the farm, it was really dry, but often you could see that there were these clouds of rain coming. But because of the microclimate environment of the farm, they just seemed to go around. This is what one of the farmers had told us. So in the next slide, so when I'm doing field recordings on a field trip, I try to collect a variety of different frequencies, timbres, textures, and rhythms. So I was able to catch some basic drone and high frequencies, but I wanted some more sort of percussion sounds. So I found a lot of these water pipes, the plastic water pipes, and they had some ribbing. So I took an object and I did some recordings with a Zoom microphone and also with a contact mic. So in the performance I'll do, you'll be able to hear these very bassy kind of plastic tubing sounds, and you'll know what it's from. So there was a lot, and I think I was interested also to try and mimic this idea of water flow, I guess, through soil, and also these kind of having to bring in soil when there's a drought, the water when there's a drought. The next photo, okay, this is, there was 3 photos that I took of different tree barks that had these nice lichens that would have been shaped somehow by the atmosphere of the farm, that were quite inspiring as well to think about how I was going to compose my work. So I didn't get any photos, but I did do a lot of recordings of like insects, and in this way trying to sort of mimic this idea of like, I guess, soil life. I couldn't record it actually, but tried to sort of just mimic it. So I got some ambient recordings of insects, and also I was making a video recording one day, and there was this bumblebee that was flying around. It was sort of attracted to the light of my screen, and I got this sort of spatialized insect sort of bee sound, which you will hear in the mix as well. Okay, so now I will perform like an assemblage of the recordings to recreate a sense of being in the farm, listening to the ambience and the objects I found. So I've assembled and spatialized these sounds in Ableton Live using Envelope for Live that allows me to create a binaural listening experience with headphones. Yeah, so you can listen with headphones. If you don't, it's okay. You can still enjoy it in stereo format. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to my other computer where I have this performance set up. So I'm going to take my headphones out and move over. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicity. That was really beautiful. I got a little bit. I closed my eyes while listening, so then I had to like come back into this realm. But I thought that we were really transported to the farm that you were on. We'll looking forward to talking more about that piece later. But now I'd like to kind of continue in this performative realm that we're in now, with an artistic presentation from Martin House, who is occupied with an investigation of the links between the earth, software, and the human psyche through the construction of experimental situations, material artworks, and texts. From 1998 to 2005, Martin was director of App, a software performance group working with electronic waste, pioneering an early approach to digital glitch. And for the last 10 years, he's initiated numerous open laboratory style projects and performed, published, lectured, and exhibited worldwide. Welcome, Martin.
Hello. So thank you, Margarita, Sonic Axe, and thank you, Felicity, for the wonderful meditative performance, just as the storm clouds are gathering outside the window. It's a really nice experience. So I'm going to be talking more or less about a kind of transition from, let's say, from extraction of the outside to endotraction, the inside, the interior, in relation to the earth, the soil, and the planet. So I'm going to be shifting, as well as shifting from interior to exterior, exterior to interior, be shifting between a presentation mode and more of a kind of experiment lab setup. So the title is more or less Interior Geology from Psychogeophysics to Tiny Mining, which you should be able to see on the first slide. So the first image on the slide, entitled Endotraction, is an image of tracing mining routes of the only remaining working uranium mine Svonost in a town called Yakimov on the Czech border. And I'll talk about this mine later, but what I'm kind of interested in is tracing and mapping the strata of my own very much collaborative work, which is concerned with the connection between the Earth and its healthiness. So this idea of planetary health is very important to me, and how this kind of intersects with computation and technology. So on this side, what we could call pollution, this notion of the pharmacon, both poison and cure, and dosage. So I'll be kind of sketching a few, or the history of these works, not so much as a catalogue, but as a way of marking this kind of shift in registration of how we come to see this new geological era. So the shift from the Earth considers something which is exterior, which is acted upon by humans, a laboratory planet, to the Earth, and geology is something which is incorporeal, incorporated, and interior. So we have this idea of interior or internal geology, a fantastic voyage from inferior geology, which is the underneath, the vast dripping caves and mines supplying energy for the server farms above ground, to interior geology, which is informed by this discipline called medical geology, which looks at the connection between primarily human health and geology. And here in this image, which is from, I think, 15th century, from the alchemist George Ripley, I'm borrowing from this idea of what he's talking about here is this idea of lower astronomy, so which is more or less bringing the planets down to Earth, so they become something which is outside, exterior to the planet, becomes embodied as the metals, which are then extracted. So these are metals which are ripe for extraction. And now I will perform some kind of experiment or lab test within the field of internal geology. So we need to, I'll be on camera, I guess. Here I am. So I'll describe a bit this apparatus and start the test, because the test takes maybe 5 minutes. But for the last project, which we'll be talking about tiny mining, I was looking at ways which you could test what are the metals which are inside the human body, heavy metals, how these can be extracted, and so on, which I'll talk about later. And there are various ways that you can perform these tests. It's quite difficult outside a specialized laboratory. I was interested in kind of like more or less a DIY approach to this. So you have these kind of tests such as this, the heavy metal screen test, which you can see here, which is kind of based on, it says, the Dithezone reagent. So this is something which is a basic colorimetric test. So you basically have something which changes color when any kind of heavy metal is present. And so these tests which I'm going to perform, these are more or less performed after we've taken certain dietary elements and certain drugs which perform this thing that's called chelation. So chelation, which is from kalos, the Greek word for claw, is a way in which metals are basically kind of mobilized out of biological tissue into the bloodstream, I guess, and then these are excreted. We also have DMPS, so these would be taken as part of the tiny mining extraction initiative, and this would be followed by our own drug, argotine, which is also a form of chelation therapy. So I'm going to start with this using one test which is more specialized, which is a voltammetric test using this kind of apparatus here, which is called a potentiostat. This one is manufactured by the company Iorodeo. And then I have some, what I'll show you is these are printed electrodes from a company called Italsense. There's no way endorsing these products, but very hard to find these specific things. And as you can see here, these printed electrodes are dipped into, at the moment, this is a conditioning solution. So I had to run the software, which is also with the hardware, is also open source. And what I'll do is actually extract this from the conditioning solution. So these electrodes need to be conditioned, first of all, in a very kind of weak acidic solution. And then I have the biological sample, which I produced this morning, going into another beaker. This is slightly diluted. And what we're going to do first of all is measure the pH of the solution with our pH probe and meter, just to see whether this is in the right kind of place for the electrodes. And this is not in the right kind of place. So I need a tissue. So what I'm going to do is add some very weak hydrochloric acid to this, using this wonderful gifted pipette. So we have 6 molar HCl, hydrochloric acid. And get this open. And one thing I've forgotten to do is to wear the rubber gloves, but it's a very weak acid solution. So we're going to put 330 microliters in here. And close this. And hopefully this gets us closer to where we want to be in terms of pH. Yes, we're now down to 3, 2.5, so that should be good. Okay. So I need to put in the stirring magnetic bar. Return the electrodes to the solution. So there will be 2 kind of phases. So I'm going to run the software on the laptop here. This is software which I've also adapted. So it's called, I run in Python, IO Rodeo stripping SWV, square wave alternatory for HM1.py. So I'm now going to turn on my homemade stirring device, which makes this wonderful noise. And starting the software on the laptop. So the stirrer will remain for the first deposition. I'm just going to turn this down. So the stirrer will remain for the first deposition, which is constant, and then there'll be the square wave phase. So what's happening is basically the electrode has certain metals such as mercury and elements such as graphite printed on the surface, and then the software and this potentiostat box basically control the amount of current, electrical current flowing through the sample liquid, and this is measured by a third part of the printed electrode, which kind of basically is stripping out these metals and seeing what is kind of left, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to leave that running, and then I'm going to show you what we could call in the presentation now, and read from a mining prospectus. So this is kind of from a company called Medivir, which is a German company. So the report is in German, but I can translate also. So I see this as kind of like a geological report for my own body, which was conducted last week. I'm not going to look so much to the creatine, which is also excreted, which is also used to be analyzed for heavy metals. And these kinds of tests would be made using quite advanced inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. I just have to keep an eye on the software. I'm going to go straight to the measurement values of the Messwerte in micrograms per liter. So aluminium, we have 4.1, and I kind of like these, how to say, like these kind of speed bars, or however you describe these, which you can see in the green and the red. Like when it's in the red, this is obviously something which is not to be taken lightly, but also, as you can see on the Eisen in Euro, the red is like far to the left also. So deficiency is as damaging as excess in this case, which is something which I'm kind of interested in, and we'll talk about a bit further. So I have very little aluminium. Antimony is 0.25. I'm just turning off this for the square wave voltammetry. Lead, which is Bly, is low, which was kind of surprising me. What we do have is a large amount of arsenic. Okay. And just by chance, we can return to the camera, and I have an example of an arsenic ore, which I'll handle with the glove. So this is Realgar from China, which is an ore of arsenic. But this in no way relates to the reason why I might have excessive arsenic within my body. So as a kind of mining prospect, this is something which could be mined from my body. So now what I'm going to do is share the results of the test, which I just conducted. I can find. There. So you should be able to see now, which is kind of rather surprising on the shared screen. There's like a giant peak, which doesn't somehow look right to me. This would kind of indicate the presence of lead, pretty much, but it's just kind of looking very strange. Like I've never normally I'll go back to the presentation just to show what this should be looking like. So this is would be kind of like a control test for lead, and we have a very nice, like, smooth curve around like the potential of minus 0.55. So this is what should be happening with our lead. Okay, so I'm not sure whether that was such a successful exercise, but it shows an example of how to prospect for these kind of inner geological elements. So now I'll start talking about, or kind of tracing, these strata which somehow shift from an obsession with kind of exterior geology to the interior world of tiny mining, let's say. So this is kind of a kind of period of kind of collective works, which went under the title of psychogeophysics. So this is maybe 10, 12 years ago, something which is still ongoing and was more or less attempting to define a new discipline, which is somehow summed up by this quotation, which is from A Sedimentation of the Mind by Robert Smithson, written in 1966, which I'll read out. The shapes of the chasms themselves become verbal roots that spell out the difference between darkness and light. Poe ends his mental maze with the sentence, I have graven it within the hills, and my vengeance upon the dust within the rock. Which for me is kind of like a very condensed way. Also, this idea of a sedimentation of the mind, and a lot of what Robert Smithson was writing about is this idea or this question of like, how does the earth program or encode living beings? And what is this kind of obviously multifaceted exchange between the earth and symbolic or coded structures, in a sense, like how are these coded within the earth in the case of technology, but how also in the case of psychogeophysics, I was looking more at how the earth somehow could be seen as encoding us. So psycho, on the one hand, whereas psychogeography can be defined as an examination of the total effects of geography and place on the individual, psychogeophysics expanded this to embrace geophysics. So talking at like underground or telluric currents, the Earth's physical properties, which are tied to the sun, the planets, the moon, and so on. So it's really like somehow about taking this very literally. So as you can see here, these were some experiments conducted in London during the first Psychogeophysics Summit at certain defined locations and in Tempelhofer Feld in Berlin. And these were inspired by the work of Michael Persinger, the God Helmet, which was looking at ways in which geomagnetic fields introduce different moods or emotional states, mystical states, and so on. But we kind of tried to take this further. This was also collaborative work with artists such as Jonathan Kemp. Take this further by literally kind of tapping into Earth currents, underground currents running through the Earth, and putting these directly into coils on the sun, which would have close proximity to the human brain. So there are other exercises. This is the Psychogeophysics Walker, which was also mapping brainwave activity to location, to geophysical measurements of resistance, and so on. Algorithmic walking, telluric navigation, these kind of ideas. So the next kind of stage in this kind of journey towards the interior and the relation to technology, we could call Earth computing, let's say, or there were also ideas which I was looking at, like sketches for an Earth computer. This image, again, a collaborative work with Jonathan Kemp, is literally a model for embedding computation within the Earth. So this is like a simple fluid logic gate. So the idea was that if we have like tens of thousands of these concrete cast logic gates, they would form some kind of computational device. There are other works or sketches which asked literally how a computing device could be constructed from the Earth, like what elements such as memory, power, logic could be taken from the Earth in different forms, earthbound entities, how we could grow a computer in a forest, which could be programmed by the worms, connected in a network of mycelium, and output by crows. Associated projects such as EarthBoot, which looked somehow at how the Earth could literally be writing software which would boot up a computer. So instead of having an operating system which you would download from a vendor such as Apple, the Earth would literally, through these kind of small changes in voltage underground, would boot up the computer, resulting often in crashes, kind of quite interesting crashes. Another work which belongs more to a later project, which I'll talk about very shortly, Dissolutions. This is Test Execution Host, which was again taking this idea quite literally of how we can compute geologically. So this was more or less a very leaky Turing machine constructed from electronic waste and rocks which will be salvaged from mostly gold mining areas close to wherever this work was exhibited. So now I'm moving to the next stage, which is more or less refocusing on the material substrate of computation. So more heading towards extraction rather than working in the opposite direction. It's really looking at how technology is something which has come from the earth. And here's a modified quotation from Basil Valentine. All technology that is derived of earth must be decomposed and again reduced to earth. So the Crystal World, a collaborative series of workshops, exhibitions, and performances with Jonathan Kemp and Ryan Jordan, examined more or less the material basis of communications and control technologies, looking, I think what was important was like how these could be like somehow broken down and reconstituted, reworked in new aesthetics. So as some kind of ritual to complete cycles of extraction, in which we have like the pollution of earth, which is being upturned, resulting in things like acid rain, and obsolescence of technology, which is then returning the byproducts of the extraction of precious metals from old technology to the earth. So it's kind of like both sides of this cycle. The extraction, which is somehow polluting in terms of exposing lots of raw material to rain, which then creates acids and so on. And then the other side is when we have junked computers and we try to extract gold and other precious elements such as copper from them. This is also something which involves dangerous chemistry, strong acids, the extraction of gold also involving cyanide. So the Crystal World was very much about learning how to extract and work with these metals, how to extract so-called precious metals, rare earth elements from obsolete technology, working with alchemical techniques such as dissolution, working with earthy materials, minerals and ores, which can be refined to make acids. And I think the kind of the final project within this kind of cycle of extraction was dissolutions, which was residency and so on, series of workshops, expeditions, field trips, and exhibition in Montreal and northern Quebec. So looking at the intersection of raw and earthy salvage, the leakage of mining actions within algorithmic landscapes of abandoned and working gold mines in Canada. This also involved reworking earth and water samples and working with ceramicists with these kind of earth samples, conducting alchemical experiments, as you can see here, within disused gold refining, milling stations. And here we can see some of the kind of the landscapes that we encountered on these trips. Here we have like circulating water, cyanide. These were kind of mostly sites which we entered through whatever means we could find. So this was like a small group of artists on a kind of unofficial expedition in these parts. We have these kind of lakes of acid water, again, alchemical experiments within abandoned mines, losing our way around various lakes, substations, again, the whole landscape stained with red, blue coloration. And so this was somehow during this kind of expedition or this period, working very closely with these materials, these very kind of earthy substrates, I guess. It became a question of kind of like, or I became somehow obsessed with this idea of exposure. Like I was very worried during this, or paranoid during this kind of series of field trips, that we were kind of being exposed to perhaps toxic elements such as the cyanide water. The cyanide is used in gold extraction. And then we have kind of arsenic containing compounds which have come out of the same mining areas. So I became somehow obsessed with with the contact or the exposure to these dangerous elements that would be kind of literally like caking our clothes because you're scrambling around these sites, taking samples of water, of earth. The whole interior of the car became this kind of muddy kind of excess. Your skin would be kind of stained by these various chemistries. So I was kind of very much concerned about this kind of bodily contact with these elements, and this became somehow a kind of new obsession in a way. perhaps with this kind of immersion or contact with the Earth. So then later, there are more or less a few projects involved in the, how to say, becoming closer to the softer geologies of peat bogs in Finland. And in this case, as you see here, bathing in radioactive water in the Svornost uranium mine, the working uranium mine, which I showed the picture of the shafts descending the strata in the first image, which is kind of my most recent kind of obsession with these radon waters, with this idea that something which is considered very dangerous, radioactive emissions, is actually something which is somehow considered also by somehow some kind of underground community as being very healthy. So it's just again to come back to this idea of the pharmacon and to talk about medical geology, which I mentioned at the beginning, which is this question of what does the geological realm have to do with human health, which led me also to this idea of planetary health, how these two things could be maybe linked, but there's something more complex going on here in terms of the idea of pharmacon, which I mentioned, which is seen, or this term for something which is both cure, poison, and drug. So there was also the alchemist Paracelsus was talking about this. Recently, Derrida writing about the pharmacon as technology. So some of the pharmacon institutes the cut or the refinement in the world. And so what I was interested in, we talked also, or now moved to this project Tiny Mining, the most recent project. And as part of this project, I was consulting a medical geologist, so I became very much interested in this realm of medical geology. And I found this wonderful, how do you call this? Diagram, I guess, or schematic picture, as they call it, which shows like the optimal concentration or nutrient or metal or element, which is in the middle. And then either side, we have descending through marginal deficiency, toxicity, to death on either side. So this is again what was very much emphasized with talking with the medical geologist, was this idea that a deficiency is as bad as an excess. So also we kind of, I don't know, somehow this started me thinking about pollution, but also this project Tiny Mining was about somehow an excessive ecological concern. So Tiny Mining can be characterized as the first mineral exploration cooperative and resource specialist committed to the open source extraction from the interior of the human body of rare earth and other mineral resources in the interest of human and planetary health and to create sustainable values. And I'll end with the kind of the mission statement of the Tiny Mining community, which somehow I initiated as a realm or as a series of online sweatshops, which you can see here. So this is kind of like the mission statement of the Tiny Mining community. We believe that the earth should remain as pristine and untouched nature. We have no desire to carry on extracting resources from a depleted world, polluting and laying waste the landscape. Saving the planet is now a matter of becoming sensitive to our own geological being. In mining ourselves, we gain knowledge of our own bodies, ourselves, and the global environment. This is a final ecology for the end days. Nature will remain, and our technologies will now be sourced from within. We will thus no longer be dependent on scarce and already polluted environmental resources. And I think, as Margarita mentioned at the beginning in the introduction, there is a series of online tutorials. So these kind of more or less provide an introduction to the course of Tiny Mining, from ingestion, chelation testing to final extraction. And we're also in development of various kind of pharmaceutical products, such as the argentine, which facilitate this extraction. So this is something which is, I think for me, more about, although the projects start looking really at like what could be the economic benefits of mining from the inside of the human body, but now becomes more about like what belief systems are involved in such an activity, how it relates to ecology, but also how in some ways one can start to look at this dreaded word we was talking with Marguerite about a few weeks ago in conversations, dreaded word, the Anthropocene. Um, so somehow tiny mining, or this idea of interior geology, provides another way of looking at um, the Anthropocene, not as something which is somehow to be celebrated or somehow as spectacular, as out there, as something to be marked and viewed, but somehow kind of ushers in perhaps a new era of considering ourselves as part of the geology, whatever that might be. Geology not considered as science, which is also part of extraction, but perhaps a new way of negotiating both of those fields in a sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. And for that experiment, I checked out
Yeah,
the
I'm not
chat
sure
a little
how.
bit while you were doing it, and people were like, "Whoa!" But it was nice to
No,
see
I'll
it
drink
live.
it.
Thank you. Yeah, as you mentioned that the tutorials. So for those of you who were like, "Wow, this experiment's amazing! I want to learn how to do it myself." I also want to extract metals from my own body. There's all the tutorials and also information about all the different metals are available on this tiny mining site. It's tinymining.v2.nl, and I think Mirna will probably also share that in the chat, so you can all go there. Thank you so much, Martin. We'll see you later during
Thank
the
you, Margarita.
conversation.
Thank you.
Great. So for our final speakers for tonight, I'm really excited to have both Kunal Palavat and Dorsey Kaufman here together to present their work, research, and the interconnections between their two practices. Kunal is a terrestrial biogeochemist and critical ecologist currently working at the intersections of pollution, community-based research, data science, and environmental justice at the University of Arizona in the Ramirez Andreotta Lab. They're also a lab manager and research associate with the Critical Ecology Lab, a nonprofit research and education container striving to explicitly connect systems of oppression and liberation to global change. And Dorsey Kaufman actively challenges disciplinary boundaries by making work at the intersection of art, environmental science, and politics. She primarily works in time-based media, including video, performance, animation, and 3D installations. Her practice examines the conflict among corporations, governments, and community health. And her work visualizes how these tensions and perceptions constantly define and redefine our built environment. And Kunal and Dorsey also work together on Project Harvest, which I believe they'll touch on during the presentation. I'm really looking forward to this. So welcome. I'll let you two take it from here.
Thank you for that introduction, Margarita. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with folks today. Our talk is titled Night Air and Desert Soils, Communicating Contaminated Lands and Waters Across Arizona. And you gave a great introduction, and I just want to highlight that for me, I think I'm starting to see my role in my not solely as a scientist, but striving towards being a community organizer, where I use science as one of many, many tools for community action and power redistribution, and that my goal is not to quote unquote create new knowledge or discover, but to combat systems of oppression and amplify systems of liberation.
So as an artist, some of you might be wondering, why am I working in an environmental science setting? So I was brought into Ramirez Andreotta's lab to consider how to visualize environmental data in new ways that could engage people differently than what is traditionally used in science communication. And so thinking about connecting the data more to natural experiences and people's senses, and also thinking about how to generate behavioral change and how people act within their environment. And this is me as a young kid and then now. And so we wanted to get started with just talking about the connection between the visual and the scientific. So many of the ways that we perceive scientific phenomenon first comes to us through our eyes. And so in the US, this takes the form of, various years leading up to this year, but this year probably being the most intense this past summer was the orange skies in California due to the wildfires. Or in 2015, when the Animas River turned bright yellow and orange due to breaking open of a mining pit. And those sort of visual events alert us that our environment is negatively impacted and that something has to be done. And so similarly, mining is an incredibly visual and sensory experience. So the next slide shows a quote that, maybe not. Yeah, here we go. The next slide shows that, or this slide shows a quote from one of our participants that we work with in the project, and talks about the experience of being in a mining community. So the whole scape changes, the noises and the smells change. People talk about the fumes being so bad that it would burn their eyes, that they couldn't breathe properly. And this really serves as the background to confront this challenge of how to present scientific information visually so that it connects people through their lived experiences.
So let's situate ourselves a little bit. I wanted to put this map up just to show that Dorsey and I are over here in Arizona, and I tagged Amsterdam over here, and we're about more than 6,000 miles apart. And I wanted to call in the environments, lands, waters, airs, and legacies that are connecting us, and the histories of oppression, of liberation, of colonization that influence why I'm in this spot today and why we are even studying extraction and mining and these white supremacist ways of relating to the environment. And the project that Dorsey and I are part of, Project Harvest, works in Arizona with these 4 communities primarily, which are all environmental justice communities. They're disproportionately impacted by environmental harms. 3 of them are rural. Dewey, Globe, Hayden are rural, and Tucson is an urban area in Arizona. And the project is co-created, meaning with community members, meaning that we work with people from each of those towns in every step of the scientific process. They're the ones guiding the research questions, the kinds of methods we do, the kinds of analyses that will get at answering the questions. And so these photos show some of the community engagement, the community health workers that we work with who are from each town. And then this photo here shows the PI, the principal investigator of the project, Dr. Ramirez Andriota, showing folks how to sample soils from their backyard, because this is a community-based environmental monitoring study where people in the towns are collecting samples from their own backyard, their own gardens, their own rainwater harvesting systems for analysis in the lab and to look at contamination. So the next few slides, I'll be focusing on the soil and specifically on arsenic, looking at questions of what is the contamination, at a baseline, what is going on in these gardens across the state? And then is the contamination related to different point sources of pollution, really clear sources of extraction, and focusing in on arsenic because it is of primary public health concern and is a known carcinogen, is associated with skin diseases, lung diseases, and more. So this slide is showing the weighted mean or geometric mean arsenic concentrations in the soils of each community. And we see differences here where it could have to do with the different kinds of resource extraction in these towns. It could have to do with weather patterns and more. And at a baseline, when we try and assess contamination, one of the ways we do that is by using regulatory standards. So the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality has a residential soil remediation level, where above that level, it's recommended to remediate your soils in some way. And so the Arizona standard is 10 milligrams per kilogram. And 22 samples in our data set out of 175 exceeded that standard. And for context, I was looking up the Dutch intervention levels, and the Dutch level is 76 milligrams per kilogram, not 10. So it's way up there. And none of our soils exceed the Dutch level. And I think that is an interesting conversation there around what goes into creating these standards. It's not just human health risk that goes into it. It has to do with feasibility of cleanup, economics, and cultures around contamination, maybe even background levels in the region. And so I think it calls attention to how place-based our analyses and relationships to environment have to be, and even our understandings of contamination have to be really place-based and site-specific. And so I'm going to be focusing in now on Hayden-Winkelman, one of the rural communities in the project that is also the site of the active copper smelter run by ASARCO. So this map shows a bird's eye view of town with the smelter tagged in blue here. This is another photo showing the smelter's smokestack from a view of the high school pool. This photo shows another view of the smelter and really gets at how embedded these operations are in town, right next to the homes that people are living in. We can start to piece apart some of the spatial patterns going on. And so if we categorize our sites as our homes, like in the study, as west of the smelter and south of the smelter, this plot shows arsenic concentrations in the soil by those two areas. And we see significantly higher arsenic concentrations in the soil west of the smelter than south. This is based on linear mixed modeling and could have to do with proximity, because those sites west of the smelter are closer to the smelter and are also closer to the tailings here, mine tailings. It could have to do with wind patterns, and we're currently working to figure out why we see these trends more specifically. And also all of the exceedances of that Arizona remediation level all happen in the western sites. And so we've established that there is some degree of contamination higher west of the smelter, but if we can also we can start to look at exactly the impact of the smelter itself. And so if we graph the distance of each home from the smelter to its arsenic concentration, we see a trend, a significant trend, where the further away from the smelter a house is, the lower arsenic it'll have in the soil. And this trend is also true for lead, for copper, and a few other metals as well. And now, this work doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? People are living in this town, the smelter is active, and there is incredible community organizing and political and economic discourse throughout the course of Project Harvest, and where the unions and workers at the smelter striked and essentially shut down smelting operations for about 9 months. And we have data, rainwater data this time, that I'll show from before and after the strike. This plot shows arsenic concentrations in the harvested rainwater for sites west of the smelter and sites south of the smelter, before the strike in this purple and after the strike in blue. And we see a significant decrease once the strike started and the smelter shut down in arsenic concentrations. And so what are some of these findings pointing to? Things that we already know, right? That point sources of pollution, mines, sites of extraction impact environmental quality, and that shutting down those sites would decrease contamination. But why do we keep studying this work if we already know those things? And the framework that we take is a co-created citizen science project to really get at the culture and the immediate impacts of what's going on. because the people that are living here, they're marginalized in so many ways, and their experiences need to be uplifted. And working in community also allows us to get at some of those cultures and systems that influence the contamination that we see, where things like U.S. consumer culture, racial capitalism and white supremacy actually demand that this mine exists and that we continue to extract. And so the work that we're doing here in Project Harvest is one of the first steps towards getting at that culture shift that we want, right? This monitoring is one of the first things that will lead to community and individual action.
So, like Kunal mentioned, the data collected and analyzed in Project Harvest can be used in so many ways scientifically, but also, most importantly, needs to be accessible to the community first and foremost, because they're the people who want to know what's going on in my environment, and they're the people who can benefit from knowing that if they live west of the smelter, they are going to be seeing higher levels of contamination. And so this is what really came down to the core of how do we present this information to the community in a way that they can understand, in a way that will be impactful and useful to them. And we know that data can really ground their lived experiences with pollution. So if they're witnessing health issues in their area, if they're noticing that plants in their garden don't grow like they should, then receiving that data can actually give them evidence to sort of back up what they may notice around them and their own perceptions and lived experiences. So what we've seen in science communication is that it requires more than just the science in order to tackle environmental challenges. It actually is about bringing science to the table, but then actually putting science to use in the community. And so the doctor of our lab really recognized that existing research shows the way that scientists communicate environmental data through explanatory graphics like bar graphs and printed reports really do not engage all audiences and have not affected people's decision making and actions that they take in their environment. And so data is typically not presented in a personable way so that people can see the connection between the environmental data and their everyday lives. So we're exploring the use of different data sharing methods. And this is where the interactive art installation called Ripple Effect was created by myself. And here's a video that explains what the concept is and how it was employed in the communities. So, ripple effect is an experience that's meant to ground the data driven environmental discussion in a sensorial, empathetic art experiences that exists for the viewer in 3D space. And the installation is really meant to serve as a reminder that our actions have a profound and direct impact on the most precious source of life on Earth. So, in this installation, this is showing the rainwater data that participants collected, and they get to see their own data come to life in front of them and then decide how they're going to respond to that. What do they want to do now that they see either elevated levels or very calm and still waters? And the reason that I chose ripple effect as the name, and we can kind of go through some of these as I'm giving this explanation, is to connect with the phenomenon of ripples expanding across water in response to an initial disturbance. So that's the water cymatic patterns that emerge. And it provides this metaphor for confronting people to reflect on how their actions or inactions reverberate throughout the physical and social world. So here's a close up. You can kind of see what that vibration and activity looks like. So the concept really began when I met with a digital sound engineer, Nima Hamidi, and we noticed similarities between the way that he composed his musical compositions. And there was a certain, on the right, you'll see the picture, there was a certain crescendo and decrescendo that happened in the sound. And I was making graphs at the time and saw that there were some interesting similarities with the fluctuation of chemical concentration data in these communities. And so through Max MSP, which is the visual programming language, we use sonic parameters to map the higher contamination levels to more amplitude, more resonance and bass, and then lower frequency, because that also increases that vibration and the ripples in the water. And so after months and months of experimenting with speakers, water, amplifier, and Arduinos, which aren't the best combination of mediums together in my studio, there were some technology heating up that I had to take care of. I was able to prototype the installation and pitch the idea to the doctor of our laboratory, Dr. Ramirez Andriota. And in order to make sure this data sharing method would be understandable and useful to community members, because we want to make sure that they're getting the information they need, we conducted a series of formative evaluation sessions, which is basically a way to show prototypes, different stages of prototypes of the experience. And we did these with local community health workers or promotoras from each community, from each mining community, and they provided feedback and made suggestions on the design that then I would implement back into the experience. And so this is part of an equity-centered community design framework where you're really letting go of your own power as an artist and designer and making it about how do you want your results shown instead of this is how it's going to look and this is what I've created. And so through these sessions, we fulfilled what's called a user's right to design this experience. And ultimately, they gave the go-ahead to use Ripple Effect to show their rainwater results, paired with a booklet that would show also their soil and plant results. And so since our lab wanted to understand the impact of data sharing methods, we conducted a case control study. So half of our participants received their information through booklets, so with the more traditional strip plot graphs, and then the other half received a booklet along with the Ripple Effect experience to see what difference that made in community action and data interpretation. And so we can go through these next slides that just show all of the places that this was exhibited in Tucson, in South Tucson to our Spanish-speaking participants. And this is when you could host public events. It was the year 2018. We really wanted to implement it in these community settings. So this is in a local museum. The next one is in a high school. And we also did one in the basement of a library. So it's very different from the pristine kind of cube of the museum and kind of into these more local gathering spaces. And so now Ripple Effect has communicated data in a variety of settings in Biosphere 2 and at SXSW Festival, and will go to the Venice Biennial for the summer of 2022. And as you can see by these pictures, we get a lot of animated responses from this vibrating water. And so we actually measure and see what information comes from that. How are people acting upon this by conducting these focus groups at the end of the event? And so these are some quotes that participants have shared talking about all of their senses being engaged. And also, I love the bottom one says that, this is a new way of showing data. And because on paper, if we saw this, we might be falling asleep by now. So that kind of talks about the difference of experiences. And then there are some other quotes on the next slide that talk about having a bigger impact than just looking at a static graph with little circles and different shapes, and talking about the suspense of finding your key and then plugging it in to the ripple effect. Another participant mentioned the accessibility. They had poor eyesight, so they actually preferred listening to the data through ripple effect. And for them, it was easier to hear it than to see it. So the overall question that we set out to answer was, did the art exhibition inspire participants to take environmental action? And we were able to measure this. And I'm going to share some of our findings. Out of the 19 participants who gave responses, all of the ripple effect participants intended to take action based on their data, whereas less than half of the participants in the booklet only group wanted to change their behavior. And so we did find this to be a significant relationship between data sharing method and intention to act through a chi-squared test. And we actually followed up and saw that ripple effect participants did indeed take action 6 months after the event. And then this also shows that people that were in ripple effect recalled their data more specifically than the booklet only groups. And this is also a significant relationship of memory recall and data sharing type. So we also found that participants preferred looking at both of the methods. And so our results indicated that environmental art can not only communicate complex scientific data effectively, but can also overcome barriers associated with traditional science communication by affecting people's attention, emotion, and memory. This heightened engagement in environmental artworks can have a long-lasting impact, so people remember it and then they're more likely to take action. And so through working closely together within the lab, Kunal and I realized that although they are in the environmental science department and I'm in the School of Art, these separate fields are much more interconnected when applied in this community setting and making information actionable to people. So this can really inform and inspire people to change historical patterns and behaviors that have harmed the environment and community health.
And building off what Dorsey said, this creation of new frameworks to recognize this connectedness between social and environment in everyday lives is incredibly important. And because in so many ways, again, we're repeating ourselves in different silos. We know outside of the academy that art is important and influential. We know that pollution is happening and mines make it worse. We know that colonization and racial capitalism are ongoing processes that influence everything we do and all of our experiences. And it feels like we're running in place, right? And so I'm excited to present some work done on critical ecology, which is a field started by Dr. Suzanne Pierre that asks us to really pause and think critically in community, in relationship with each other and environment, and start walking towards liberation and integrate the social critique with environmental measurement. So to give us some more context around that, this figure shows the traditional framing of environmental change, where there's some sort of human activity that causes an environmental impact. Here, fossil fuel combustion causes increased CO2 in the atmosphere, which causes a global change and has ecological and evolutionary impacts, biogeochemical feedbacks. And then we, in response to those feedbacks, usually think about sustainability, we think about technocratic innovation and like economic strategies. But this whole framework really ignores all of the social drivers of biophysical change. Human activity, the Anthropocene, is really extremely coded language for saying white supremacy and colonization, because it's not all human activity that is causing these environmental harms. And so what is influencing the human activity? What cultures, social systems, ideologies cause humans to have certain standpoints and beliefs and relationships to environment? We have to understand these if we're going to change our systems, right? We can't keep running in place. So a framework that critical ecology has developed is this reorganized way to think about drivers of environmental change, where the primary drivers are biophysical factors. And so those are things that environmental scientists measure most often. So it's things like arsenic in the rainwater or lead in soil. And we can map them spatially. We can look at trends and differences by time or treatments. And that's kind of the majority of environmental research is here. And then secondary drivers bring in and integrate the influence of human activities. So how does the creation of a mine, an extraction of a mine, influence contamination? How does the way a city set up influence influence and perpetuate gentrification and disproportionate like air quality? How does a strike, even as a human activity, influence environmental contamination? And this is fields of like environmental justice, critical geography, political ecology are really concerned with these primary and secondary drivers. But critical ecology, and Suzanne Pierre asked us to really look at these tertiary drivers as well and explicitly connect the social systems and cultures to the human activity. So how does white supremacy and capitalism necessitate the mind to exist, which then has the environmental impacts? How does that system of how can we measure that system of oppression in really clear ways so that we can then name it and then change and shift away? How does the systems of solidarity and union work and working class labor rights, how are those tertiary drivers that influence why that strike was able to happen and then why contamination decreased, right? We can map these systems of liberation and oppression. And another example that the lab is working on is a critical ecology of slave-based monoculture in the Danish colony of St. Croix, where we're really looking at questions of how did the enslavement of Africans for sugarcane monoculture and cane refinement influence soil, influence people, plant communities over time. And so we can go into the soil horizon and correlate different depths to different time points, and then map physiochemical properties of the soil, things like metal, things like carbon, in different layers of the soil to different time points, and then integrating that data with information from archaeologists and anthropologists and history around colonization of St. Croix, we can really tie together this picture of the impacts of the transatlantic slave trade and colonization. And so I wanted to end up with those thoughts and really call to action about naming explicitly the systems that and cultures that influence our world and how what we do does or does not perpetuate those systems. And a huge thank you to everybody involved in our variety of projects, and Dorsey as well. It's been incredible. Kind of combine and blend our art and science together.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having us.
Yes, we're back. Thank you so much. It's really great to see all these amazing projects you're working on. I'm going to now we're going to move into the kind of Q&A conversation period. And this is also the time for people who are watching via the live stream to ask questions in the chat, because those can also be brought in here. So please do so. So I'm also going to welcome Martin and Felicity also back into the conversation. I want to touch on kind of one question that's actually related to the Ripple Effect project, and then Kunal also kind of mentioned this, which is about when you were sort of relating Dutch soil toxicity standards with the U.S. based ones, and then to really think about these kind of cultural variations in regards to pollution and toxicity. And I was also thinking about the Ripple Effect project traveling, and I was wondering if it's maybe if you run into other kinds of obstacles getting people to engage in a project with data from Arizona, for example, or are you thinking of sort of having data from specific locations to make it kind of more local when it's exhibited in different places?
Yeah, so the real impact of ripple effect is that it has to use a data set that's local to its environment. And so when it traveled to Michigan, I was able to get special access to a Flint data set, and that's what I used for that exhibition. And then when it goes to Venice, similarly, it's going to be using a water quality data set from Venice by a researcher there. So that's definitely something that is a part of the exhibition that I always keep intact, is that it has to connect to the place where it's being exhibited. And by that sense, it almost becomes a sort of like a graph system, right? Where you can plug in the data and that's what it then communicates.
Great, thank you. I don't know if Kunal, you wanted to add anything to this kind of geospecificity of the kind of research that you're working on.
Yeah, I just want to add and advocate again for community-based work, community-based research and art that is working with people that are experiencing the environments that we study. And I, for example, am in the lab and I'm in on my computer and I'm not the one living every single day with the soils, with the water, with the plants. And so making sure that the work that I am doing is as connected and as much as I can, amplifying the needs of the people experiencing the harm.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think there's also quite a lot of sort of geo specificity in all the projects, with Martin down to the individual level, and with Felicity's work as well. I had a question for all of you actually, because I know Kunal, when I was talking to you, I asked you to send a picture, and then you were like, "Oh, do you want my headshot, or do you want me in the dirt and touching the soil?" And then I was also thinking of the Felicity's picture that she shared of her on this farm, and these community oriented projects, and then of course Martin getting even more into these chemical processes of the earth. And I wanted to ask all of you actually, what is it about kind of getting in the dirt, and really also this kind of materiality or the physicality of soil or the earth that is important to your practices? Maybe we can start with Felicity. Oh, and don't forget to unmute yourself.
I guess it's interesting, because for when I started the project, I really didn't have any idea about soil, and over time I learned more and more about it through reading and seeing things on the internet, and but it was just I don't know, the mystery of kind of getting into something that I don't know, it was I don't know. Yeah, it's just really interesting for a long time. I don't know, it's so dense, and you can just keep pulling it apart and digging deeper and deeper into it. It's something yeah, it's I don't know, it's almost like a religion or something. Yeah.
Thank you, Felicity. Martin, do you want to say something about your relationship to the earth and to soil?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's something which is so kind of long standing. It's really hard to talk about, I think. Is there something that you really, I don't know, some things I mentioned in the presentation was also for example, working with these peat bogs, and you just have this kind of desire to get into this peat bog and really sink up to, I don't know, however far. So we're kind of doing this as a kind of a group process of running and sinking and being in these peat bogs as a way of that it's not something which is really it's not something external to you, like it's not something out there, that you observe or study, but it's really something which you experience as like a temperature. Like in Finland, it was summer but cold, and then this peat bog, you have this kind of quite warm, I don't know, very intense experience. And also with this radon water, which I showed at some point, this is just like how you kind of become immersed in something and really feel something physical, like eating or drinking, or like it's a completely different kind of way of communicating or being with some other entity, or with the mushroom mycelium and smelling, and so much about these kind of other, not other experiences, but experiences, I guess. And I think it's kind of an important side, which then becomes one facet of like what Kunal and Dorsey are talking about. Like these are all kind of interlinked, these ways of kind of experiencing.
Thank you, Martin. Maybe Dorsey?
I'd like to think my relationship with the environment, especially since I was young, I was trained as a dancer and I danced my whole life. And there's been this theme for my work as like movement and time is around the experience of connecting with environment. And so it's kind of like translated into my art then of like how I embody and talk about embodied knowledge of the surrounding environment. But then I think there's also, for me, something about bearing witness to these altered landscapes that is very important as people doing work and showing scientific information about the land. Is that, having that experience when first going to a mining community for the first time and not just doing the research on it, in the lab, but actually going into these spaces with lab members and with the doctor of our lab and seeing something like a huge slag pile or a pile of tailings that at first, upon first glance, you would think this is a magnificent sight and it's strange. And I know that something is different, but I'm not sure why I have this feeling of awe and unease at the same time. I mean, that's a big part of the practice as well. And I actually looked into that phenomenon that occurs where you appreciate something at the same time as feeling kind of like, oh, this is a contaminated environment, which is called the visual sublime. So I think that part of bearing witness and seeing is really core to talking about nature and talking about our relationship with the natural and built environment.
Thank you, Dorsey. And Kunal?
I love that question so much, and I could talk about and do talk about my relationship to environment nonstop. And I really resonate with what Felicity and Dorsey were saying, and that I also don't view the environment or nature as separate from myself. Like I am part of the environment is part of me. Like there is no delineation, like my delineation between the environment and me. Like we're one and the same. And because of that, so then often think about environment in terms of power and in terms of positionality, and how my like positive experiences are privileged experiences with the environment, and my negative experiences with the environment are marginalized in some way. So that I can go onto a farm and love the smell of the bacteria in the soil, knowing that there's medicine in there healing me, and vice versa, like giving back in a reciprocal way, and knowing that the pollution from the areas I grew up in contributed to why I have asthma today, and allergies even, and like these seemingly disparate experiences, I think is something that I spend a lot of time on, thinking about my relationship to environment, because it's not consistent and it's not easy to disentangle. And so I think that, long story short, I really think that there is no separation, and thinking about environment in terms of power and in terms of access and privileges is like a really necessary way to understand that relationship.
Thank you, Kunal. There's actually a question from the audience for Dorsey. It's quite technically specific, so let's hope. And the question is, when cymatics from these soil layers are parallel to other sound wave phenomena, what does it tell about this soil layer data and its specific information transfer? You could also read it in the chat if it's easier to read it instead of listening to me say it. There's a little chat box on the left in this
Okay.
space. Sometimes it
Yeah,
helps to
great.
read instead of having someone say it out loud.
Oh, yes, I see it. Okay. So it's interesting what you're saying, because I think what you're referencing to is that cymatics don't just occur within the water. They also specific patterns will happen. Let's say if I did not put the water on that tray with the speaker hooked up to it, if I put soil on there, for example, and I change the hertz level, certain patterns would emerge uh, from the soil being on there and responding to the vibrations. And so in the process that I'm doing, it's not a one-to-one translation. So for example, like it's not putting the water on and then all of a sudden the software is reading in real time and then producing this vibration. So I think that's important to understand about ripple effect and about water cymatics in general, is that we're actually using software technology to then create the equation essentially of the contamination data and the sonic parameters. And so that's what's allowing the information to take form and the interpretation to happen within the exhibition. But I do see what you're saying in the way that you can experiment. And this is what I did in my studio, right? Like I experimented with putting these different substrates on the vibrating bowl to see what emerged from them. And it doesn't tell you too much about the quality, but it is something that I think allows you to get this other understanding of the relationship between like playing sound and then having materials actually react to that and seeing how it changes their formation. So it's not a it's not a straightforward question, but I think answer, but I think the question is kind of what leads me to give you that explanation.
Thank you, Dorsey. There's a question that touches on what Kunal, I think, was just saying about the getting our hands in the dirt and our relationship to soil. I don't know if it's actually a question, more of a comment, but maybe you want to expand on it. But it says, thinking about our bodies as soil and earth, how the research in St. Croix is detailing the direct relationships between exploitation of African bodies and exploitation of the land. I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. That is that's the whole goal for the study. And so we're like in developing those methods right now. And I think right now we're really aiming to map the soil and the soil properties to historical time points, to the kinds of plantation agriculture that were forced on people and the island, and correlating different archival data like historical records, archaeological maps, and dig information. And then I think that there's another piece of this, that colonization is not over. We're not in a post-colonial world. We're in an actively colonizing like space, and so the impacts of colonization are still, because it's still going on. And so there's this layer of understanding the present impact of environment on people and on people and environment in St. Croix now. And so there's perhaps modeling and view around like ecological risk or like human health risk to metals in the soil. There's some other research has shown that there's high levels of lead, arsenic, and mercury closer to historical sites of plantation like infrastructure, and so we can map that and look at the like direct human health impact of like walking on that land, we can also ideally partner and are in the process of partnering with community organizations and high school groups in St. Croix to look at forms of extraction and like land use change and how that's impacting people. I think that this is also a process in experimentation and figuring out what does work and what does not work with relating soil, earth, and humans.
Thank you so much, Kunal. Actually, I want to go. Well, it touches a bit on this question that was just asked about like thinking about our bodies as soil and as earth. And actually, it's something that Martin touched on. And that actually he and I talked about a little bit when we had our first conversation together, which was about uh, how Martin, you were like kind of questioning the idea of the Anthropocene, and maybe you could also like expand on that a little bit more.
Okay, I'll try. I'm not so sure it can be so coherent, but I think it relates also to what Dorsey was saying about this sublime, that somehow, I don't know, like there are a lot of problems which could also touch on with this concept of the Anthropocene. And for me, one of those is that somehow it becomes this kind of like, I don't know, this kind of monument to that kind of humanity or this kind of or so on. Like it's kind of somehow celebratory in a sense, but also it's kind of like what we were talking about is that at the same time it's saying that we have become part of geology in a sense. And so it was kind of like what I was interested in was like how we could start to treat ourselves more humbly as part of that geology rather than it being this kind of sublime spectacle of, I don't know, which is also kind of very tempting of like I visited a lot of these kind of like open gold mining sites, and it's really like, wow, it's just like this huge thing or these huge piles and these, it's incredibly beautiful also at the same time. Like when you visit these lakes, which are just like to the horizon, just deep red at sunset. I mean, it's kind of, I don't know, incredible, but at the same time, it's like being in those places kind of, I don't know, is also kind of humbling. And that was kind of what I was thinking about with the Tiny Mining Project was how to kind of make that shift to humankind becoming geological, to make it more something which was kind of an internal experience, like more experiential rather than this spectacular celebratory thing, which is kind of outside us that we observe these kind of, I don't know, monuments, but at the same time, kind of, what is the opposite of, or something like a monument, but not a good thing? I don't know, maybe monuments aren't good things either, but you know what I mean? Somehow they become, yeah, that was kind of what I was interested in was that it becomes more something which is experienced and felt as something that we are part of internally rather than something which is kind of outside us in a sense.
Thank you.
I think it's like what Kunal said.
We can hear you.
I think he's. Oh, but is Martin still talking?
No, it's.
Oh, okay. All right, I wasn't sure, but I just wanted to add to that and saying it's like Kunal saying the general term of humanity, which is what Anthropocene has talked about, is that it's now the human activity is this sort of marker of this new geological epoch that we've shifted into. But that's not enough to just call it human activity. And I actually like Naomi Klein's description of the Anthropocene, which is the confrontation between capitalism and the planet. That to me is a much more poignant description of where we are in terms of a new era and new epoch, as in the aftermath from the industrialization that happened in the 50s. And many other things. I mean, for US slavery, I mean, there's so many other things that come along with that exploitation.
Thank you, Dorsey. Yeah, I just wanted to also add that the film that we're currently screening, just going back to actually what Kunal was talking about and the research that the Critical Ecology Lab is doing in St. Croix, the film You Think the Earth is a Dead Thing, which we're screening now, touches on the chlordazone poisoning on Martinique. So that's also very close. Very close in terms of the situation there and what's going on. So just to kind of link it together with that film. I don't know, Kunal, if you had a chance to watch it yet.
Not in forward to this weekend.
Actually, I have a question for Felicity. One thing I really liked about your bio is that you talk about like interspecies creativity, and so even thinking beyond the relationship or the collaborations between artists and scientists, I also kind of see what you're saying as like a collaboration between different species. And this is actually a question from Stefan, who's one of my colleagues, which was about this kind of collaboration you do and how you go about translating soil animal behaviors into an artistic composition. You're still muted.
I've tried to approach it in two different ways, and I guess so. Um, it kind of originally comes from, I guess, being Australian and there being such a vast like biodiversity, different like animals just growing up in this environment where it's like it is like an orchestra, and I guess this theme sort of shifts through the different projects that I do. And so anyway, so I was working with the animals, like mainly native Australian animal sounds, and then I got commissioned to do this soil project, and I had to try and translate that. And then so anyway, so yeah, I did try to do like a graphic score of like a soil profile and ask some instrumentalists to interpret that. And we had these long discussions about like this process of, I don't know, gases and different like these plants and animals layer of humus, and I'm going further down into the earth of like rock structures, and we sort of unpacked all these things, and then I tried, then they were sort of improvising and doing, so and kind of reforming a composition out of these conversations and sort of unpacking this like graphic score of a soil profile. That's like one approach, and then I do it through like electronic music. Just yeah. Does that answer the question?
Well, I think it's so hard to describe like these kinds of processes, because I was also thinking about listening to your live performance, and I was just also thinking about like how you're making choices about which sounds to play. But maybe that's a difficult question to because it could be something that's just that's difficult to kind of quantify in that way or describe maybe through the language that we have.
Yeah. I guess it's part like intuitive, like through experience, and also trying to refer to things that I've read about and images that I've seen, soil structure, and
Great, thank you. Oh, we're almost we're running out of time, and there's one final question, which is actually for everyone, from Nina, who asks, "I'm curious what kind of literature you use in your research about soil in the Anthropocene, and whether you could share some recommendations." So maybe everyone, I know it's sometimes hard to share this on the spot, but everyone could share one publication that they find important to their research or their work. I think it could be different kinds of formats. I'll just point people out like a teacher. Kunal, maybe you want to start?
I'm ready. I think a lot of work that grounds the Critical Ecology Lab is by Anna Singh, Tsing, and she has a book called The Mushroom at the End of the World, and then Catherine Yusuf has a book called A Billion Black Anthropocenes. And then there's lots of articles if you search in fields of Black ecologies and the Plantationocene, which is another phrase folks can use. There's a lot of great resources there.
Thank you. Maybe Martin, do you want to share maybe some text?
Desperately trying to think. I don't end up like taking so many things from so many different places. It's really hard to like a lot of kind of like enjoy kind of reading technical literature. I don't know, like the kind of lab reports from the Medivir people, and There's kind of the Mycelium Running book by Stamets, I think, which is also really nice. And so, yeah, reading around mycelium, dark ecology, Timothy Morton, things like this. But it's really like, I don't know, I try and cover a wide, wide ground, literally.
Thank you, Martin. Dorsey?
So there's a geographer by the name of Miguel Fernandez de Castro who has incredible work that reflects on the Anthropocene and specifically detailing how humans are part of waste. And just recently, I've really been following his work in greater detail. And he has some in conversation pieces as well with artists that I would highly recommend to anyone who wants to think critically about where we're at in relation to our environment.
Thank you so much. And Felicity? Oh, wait, you're still muted now.
I have a couple of books I've been reading lately. There's this Dirt and Soil, and it's written by this Australian farmer who's transforming his farm into like more, I know, contemporary modern ways of farming, and it goes through like the principles, and it's really cute. And yeah, this other one is like a lot of stories relating to other underground. Can you see?
Yep.
Yeah. But there's a really good bookshop in Berlin called Zabriskie Bookshop, and they have a lot of nature and environment books where I get heaps of my books from. It's really good. If you live in Berlin, you should go there.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a nice way to round it up because it sort of opens up space for people to already start looking into these books. So I'm going to thank you, everyone, for being here. We're going to just close off with a lot of thank yous. So just to give people a sense of things, we're not totally finishing, but I'm going to kind of close off this part. So before we move into the final part of our program, which is a performance by Red Brute, I just want to thank everyone that's here with us tonight and also for all the thoughtful questions and comments from everyone in the audience. Thank you to the Sonic Acts team who's worked really hard to put this event together, and also to the technical production team in the studio for such a smooth live stream experience. Thank you to Deborah Mora, Igor Dubrek, and Carl Mubarak for the live stream and the website design. So those were some of the videos that we saw kind of leading in to the program, and you kind of see these LED ones sort of floating behind me. And then, of course, a big thank you to Kunal, to Dorsey, to Felicity, and to Martin for sharing your knowledge and your practices with us tonight. It was really great to have all of you together with quite disparate and different practices, but really a lot of intersections. So that was really wonderful. Yeah, just a little reminder that our two films that we're screening, which is Mind, Soil, and You Think the Earth is a Dead Thing, are going to play until Sunday at midnight, Central European summertime. So for those of you who are in the US, just keep that in mind, or just on the a little earlier than us. And I wanted to announce that Ecos, which is a new periodic magazine from Sonic Acts about art in the age of pollution, is actually now available for pre-order. And we're going to start shipping it on the 27th of April. This magazine continues Sonic Act's emphasis on artists and thinkers that propose alternatives to the anthropocentric view that sees Earth and the non-human world as an endless resource. The first issue presents artists that focus on mining, microplastics, the origins of the blues from an indigenous perspective that sees humans as entangled with the environment, Cold War toxic legacies and depleted uranium, invasive species, and deadly clouds, and one of the epicenters of extractivist operations in the Russian Arctic. So going across quite a few different topics. And some of the artists and researchers and thinkers there are Annika Schwarzlos and Brian McKenna, Cecile Meriton, Melt Collective, Maria Mona Lisa Garavi, Devin Hentz, Angela Chan, Amane Salate, Arjuna Newman, Sarah Kanus, Kaiveli Mavro Kardopoulou, Carson Fisk Vittori, and Rosa Whiteley. So lots of really interesting artists in this first issue. And you can check out the Sonic Acts web shop for more information. I think Myrna will probably post a link in the chat. And Cecile Meriton, who's actually in the magazine, also has an interactive audio walk called Plastic Hypersea that is currently up at the NDSM Wharf in Amsterdam. It's going to be up until the end of May, and it's set in the year 2099. And it's a guided spatial and interactive experience that speculates on a possible future for the field of immunology, in which it has merged with the field of environmental health. As the listener explores the terrain, they're invited to imagine the environment as an extension of their immune system and to contemplate the many ways in which their bodies are entangled with microplastics in the sediments of Amsterdam's waterways. Ultimately, Plastic Hypersea asked listeners to abandon the war metaphors haunting immunology and to contemplate a more expanded sense of self. So if you are in Amsterdam, it's highly recommended. Also a nice artwork to see during these COVID times where we need to sort of stay away from each other and not be together in closed spaces. So it's nice to go on an audio walk. During these night air episodes, we've covered smog, we've dug deep in the soil, and then soon we're going to dive into water. Our next live event, which is going to take place on May 22nd, brings together stories about water as a site that enables alternative power relations. It aims to embed ecological struggles within the stories of modernization and nation building. The event is curated by Amina Salati as part of the Overexposed residency program. And Amade is a Rotterdam-based researcher, architect, and editor. Her practice explores subjects such as domesticity, displacement, environmental violence, geopolitics, and trauma inheritance. She's also an editor and organizer at Failed Architecture. So if those topics kind of spark something in you or spark some kind of curiosity, mark your calendars for May 22nd. With all of that out of the way, I'm really happy to welcome Red Brew to the studio. You can already see this little rotating color. Maybe you could see the colors changed a bit behind me for this performance. And it's going to be a live performance that is dedicated to soil. And Red Brood is the moniker of Rotterdam-based artist Marijn Verbiesen, part of Sweat Tongue and JSCA. As Red Brood, she is isolated, displaying a highly talented ear for day-to-day sounds, musique concrète composition, and spontaneous sound collage. So just a little word of warning, we're gonna go first into a little transition video, and then the performance will start. So don't think that we went offline, we are still here. So I hope you all enjoy the performance, and thank you so much for joining tonight. Bye.